Hi, I'm Bill with Inman Fine Arts. Welcome to your window to a beautiful world. I just finalized another painting, that's why there's some paint on here this morning, so I'm going to utilize some of that for this hollyhock piece. So I had a mixture of green there, more than likely mixed from ultramarine blue and some either cadmium yellow medium, cadmium lemon, the different transparent oxide colors that I have, like the oxide yellow, oxide orange, or oxide red. I do a mixture of all those colors to come up with my greens. Cerulean blue mixed with any combination of those. It depends on the color temperature that I'm looking for. I start off with that green mixture, put some more transparent oxide orange into it to warm it up, and then grabbed a little bit of that phthalo green, which is a much cooler green, comparatively speaking, relatively speaking. Because out in nature, you have a mix of warm and cool temperatures. So I try to start right off with my background colors with that kind of a mix. Now, sometimes I would have left the background exactly the way I first washed it in there. But in thinking about my hollyhocks, I decided that I'd much rather have a light background to contrast with the dark lavender hollyhocks that I'm putting in here. So wipe it all off and just leave a nice tone behind the hollyhocks. Here I'm kind of using the edge of the paper towel to create little fluctuations in the color, just for imagination purposes, so that we can let the viewer kind of wonder at what's back there. Alright, so we've got a simple little wash in here, and then I'm just going to get a feel for where I want the placement of the flowers and the petals and stems and other parts of the hollyhock. So I just grabbed a little of the Gamblin mineral spirits and wiped some of the color back off of there. There's so many different ways to go about any painting. I could have simply waited and taken a light color with some more opaque white and other colors in it and made a stem that way. Sometimes if I wipe the color off like that to begin with, I can get some nice transparent effects underneath the color, letting the white of the panel, the light comes through and bounces off the white of the panel and creates a more luminous feeling to it. So I just experiment. I might end up coming in later and replacing all of that. Always keep in mind that there really aren't any rules necessarily in art. There's some good guidelines and some helpful techniques that you can follow, but after you learn the basics, good drawing, sound, color understanding, learning how to work with edges and values, once you've got a good handle on those things, then it's all about play and experimentation and seeing what works and what doesn't, and working until you get exactly what it is that you envisioned in your mind for a particular piece. A lot of these small pieces like this, especially the 5x7s, I might use some of my digital reference material, but I'll have several different photos up on my monitors, sometimes up 10 or 20 images that I use, just to kind of give me some memory kickers, things that'll help bring back to my mind what it is that I saw or experienced or felt while I was out on location. And then I use my imagination for the most part to create the composition and the overall tone or feeling that I want to invoke in it. Because photographs primarily aren't going to capture what you saw with your eyes when you're out there. Because you're not just seeing with your eyes when you're on location, you're listening and feeling. You have the wind and the birds, the rustling of the trees, the babbling of the brook, as it were. For me, I will rarely use a photograph as it is. I much prefer to use my imagination and kind of like watching the clouds. Sometimes I'll put down several different colors in a color field just using the mineral spirits. We'll wash it all in, or maybe a little bit of medium like the Gamblin. Oh boy, I don't even remember what that stuff's called. Like the Gamblin Galkid, something like that. And put a bunch of colors on there and play like I'm looking at the clouds. See what I can pick out of the shapes that I've made with those color washes. And then just start cutting into it, playing with it, moving some of the shapes, manipulating others until I get a composition or some kind of an arrangement of shapes and colors and values and textures that's fun and that I enjoy and that I can work with. And oftentimes I'll develop a whole painting just from that, just using my imagination. As you can see, I didn't like that first composition. So now that I understand what I want with my background, it was easy to wipe that off, come back in with a little bit of color, wash it in there again, and then start over again. Now I have a more firm grasp of the composition that I want. The reason why I wiped all of that off and instead of just painting around them and cutting into them is this is kind of a one-shot deal with the way that I've used the background. I want to keep that spontaneous, washed-in feeling for the background. So I'm going to have to place these flowers where I want them and then develop them up as much as possible without altering the background. And if I have to, I'll come in and touch up here and there, but I'll try to keep my touch-ups so that they work with the background as it is, so that it feels as if it was spontaneous, done in one shot, and it was so clearly thought out that it didn't need any editing or erasing or changing that way. So I want to keep that feeling as long as I can in there. And you notice as I put some of those strokes down with the with the Hollyhocks, I let the brush kind of shoot out from some of the edges. So you'll see the distinct brush strokes or bristles of the brush. And that's to break up those edges. I don't want necessarily hard, crisp edges everywhere. If you look out in nature, you're just not going to see that because values intermingle and a lot of other things at play out there. It breaks up those edges. So I do that easily with my brush. I have to say that it's not always easy for me to paint this way because I do like to brandish my brush around and just let it kind of play. I like to let it just have some freedom to move around and swashbuckle and all that sort of thing. Keeping a tight rein on the brush, or at least a tighter rein than I might normally do, takes some discipline and a lot of forethought. So in putting in these hollyhocks and even the buds and other things that I'm putting in there, the leaves and buds, I'm thinking a lot about the size of the shapes, making sure that I don't get a symmetrical arrangement of similar shapes, sizes, that sort of thing. I try to vary. Some of these hollyhocks are going to be from the side, some directly facing us, others turned away from us. And that's so that it has a variety and asynchronous feeling to it. All right, so I'm actually going to have to change those. If you notice, I just put both of those leaves so that they are creating a line or almost like an arrow shaft directing the viewer right out of the painting. I don't want a strong line pushing the viewer out or cutting the painting into sections. So I'm going to want to vary the direction of one of those leaves. And here I am playing with light and shadow. So I started off with the brighter colors of the stems and leaves, more of the sun-drenched ones, and now I'm coming in and putting in some shadow work on there. Give it more of a three-dimensional quality of light and shadow. Lay it in sideways like that. Sometimes I can leave it that way, and then other times I'll just come in, lay that in sideways, take my brush, drag down through it, and I have plenty of paint there to create some fun textures and to get some brush strokes working in it. I love seeing the actual bristles of the brush in the painting. It helps to let the viewer know that this is a painting and not a photograph, and that it was manipulated by somebody wielding an actual paintbrush. Besides that, there's something about paint texture. It has a tangible quality that has always been appealing to me. I used to paint very thick. There was about a 5-year period where I'd have about a 1/4 inch, sometimes more, of paint sticking off the canvas, all up and down the canvas. It was a lot of paint. In fact, when I used to paint on canvas with stretcher bars, I'd have so much paint on there that the canvas would wobble back and forth with the weight of the paint on there. So I got from that a real love for that kind of texture. So even though I try to be a little more subtle now than my work was then, I still like to get the combination of thick and thin paint working in there. Okay, so here we're working with some dark hollyhocks, but when the sun comes through, especially on the back sides or up through where the hollyhock petals meet in the middle, they're actually open often in there, holes coming through, and the light shines in that space. What I'm doing when the light comes through and you're seeing it from the back side, oftentimes you'll get a very rich luminosity of that light coming through. That's what I'm trying to capture with those reds. Now I won't leave them necessarily like they are, as strong as they are. I'm going to do quite a bit of small manipulations and subtle shifts throughout it. But right now what I'm trying to do is experiment and determine the extent of the luminosity that I'm going to leave in there, whether I want more or less, whether I want those highlights to be warmer or cooler. I'll play for a little while. Once in a while I'll put down some colors, and the first time I do it, it just works. I think, that's it, I like it, it's good, and I'm all done. And then other times I will experiment, possibly until it's overworked. Unless I feel very strongly about it, I'm going to keep working it until it's right, until it's, I can't say right, what is that? That's kind of a relative term. Until it's the way I envisioned it. Or maybe until my wife comes in and says it's done. She's kind of my second set of eyes. None of my paintings are really complete until she comes in and gives the say-so on it. And after 25 years of marriage, she's gotten pretty good at that. So I'm not going to go through and tell you what colors necessarily I'm putting in each time. As you have the picture of my palette on there you can refer to. You can see easily what colors I'm grabbing, but I might tell you occasionally here why I use a particular color. Alizarin crimson, when you mix it with white, it almost deadens the color. I don't like to use just alizarin crimson necessarily with white. If I use alizarin crimson and white, I'll often come back in and use cad red and medium or cad red light and try to warm it up, try to infuse it with some more life, or I might even mix it with some cad yellow orange or cad lemon, something like that. Something that'll give it a little bit more life than replace some of the life that the white takes away from it. So now I'm experimenting with cool highlights compared to the warmer highlights that I could use. See, there's a possibility when I'm working with lavenders that a nice yellow highlight can be effective. Just depends on how much direct sunlight I want to have on the flowers. But that color harmony between the lavenders and the yellows can create a dynamic interplay that can become a real powerful visual treat for the viewer. So I'll play here a little while and put down some different types of highlights and see what appeals to me, what seems to be working with it, and whether I need to change that or not. Overall though, it's an overcast day, the light is cooler, so my highlights are going to be cooler as well. So when I use a paper towel like that, I try to be real clear about where the edge is, because I don't want to wipe away too much or smear it through the background on this piece. I just get an edge of that paper towel and gently swipe it through there. Alright, so you can see I'm removing the extra that I don't want, so I can get back down to the white of the panel. Then I can come back in and take some of that green, unless of course I don't realize what I have on my brush when I'm not paying close enough attention to what I'm doing. That's my eraser, and now I come back in with the same brush, and you'll notice if you've ever worked with watercolors, you can get kind of that same complication when the paint is dried and you try to come back in, you get those dark layering effects. So it just takes some manipulation with the brush. Alright, so I've cleaned off my palette and getting my thoughts clear on this, and come back in, tackle it with a fresh perspective. I turned around and looked at my mirror, looking at the composition, make sure that I like the arrangement of shapes and values. Now I can come in here and start to really develop fully the flowers. Now, I don't like to get too nitpicky about some of the details, but a few details here and there can really help to solidify the structure of what it is I'm working on, whether it's a flower or a tree or branch or a leaf. And especially if you just pick out one or two that you want to focus on. In this case, I'm playing around with the edges of petals and other things, but I won't do that everywhere throughout the painting. I'll only do that to a few of the petals, and then that will help to set the viewer's expectations for the rest of the painting. When they look at a flower, their mind will fill in the rest of the details without me being required to put detail everywhere throughout the painting. So I'll have my few favorites, or my few that are more the focal point, the center of interest. And with enough information in those few, then the rest of the flowers will seem to naturally be detailed without the detail actually being there. The human mind is an amazing instrument. In fact, when you look out at nature, at least this is what I was taught. I don't know the science behind it really or any of that, but I was taught that when you look at nature, if you see green, means there's red there. If you see yellow, there's it's opposite. Its harmony is going to be there. So when I'm painting, I try to keep that in mind. If I have red, I try to make sure that I have a green somewhere in there, some type of green. And sometimes it it really, you have to play around not just with the colors themselves, having red and green, but having maybe a warm red and a cool green, or maybe both of them will be warm temperature, both of them will be cool temperature. It's where you have to play and manipulate a little bit so that you can see what works and when it feels right. So having that color's harmony somewhere nearby will help the brain to be settled. It'll help the viewer to feel better about what they're looking at. That's really what we're doing throughout this. Is there's no necessarily right or wrong way to do something. There are an infinite variety of directions we could go with any single painting. We just have to determine, as the artist, what direction we want to go. What's our light source like? Is it a warm light source like the sun? Is it more of a cool light source in the shade and the north side of a building? Once we determine what our light source is, warm or cool, that's going to have a lot to say about whether our highlights are warm or cool, whether our shadows are warm or cool. Warm light source often means cooler shadows, but not always. And that's the fun thing about all of this. There are no, this is the way it always is. And that's what makes it so intriguing and challenging and worthwhile. So here I'm doing what we were talking about with the color harmonies, taking some yellow and putting it in there. So instead of taking that warm yellow and using it as a highlight on the edges of the petals of the hollyhocks, I'm adding that in right now to the leaves and the plant stalks. And then this is an attempt at warm and cool colors. I like to have a variety of dark and light, warm and cool, detailed and abstract, just a variety of all kinds of different considerations throughout a painting. Makes it more interesting and fun to look at. Gives the viewer a lot more to come back to. Like with these flowers, I could have just put in some dark hollyhocks, put in a couple of little highlights here and there, given it the impression that these are hollyhocks. Nobody would have questioned whether they were hollyhocks or not. But then that would be it. It'd be dramatic, the light and dark, contrast, all of that. But it wouldn't really have the little subtleties and nuances that give the viewers something more to look at each time they come back. So with a lot of my work, I play with it. Even when I could finish it more quickly, I'll play with it, hoping that I don't overwork it, but at the same time, trying to give it a little bit something more of what I consider more of value for the viewer. They can come in and say, wow, I didn't really notice that before. it's not possible to, I don't know, we could spend forever on one little painting trying to get too much of that going, I suppose. But if I can do some back and forth, working it and adding in little extras, then I'll do as much as I can in the time I give myself. With a 5x7, I know that if I work it for 2 days, then I've overworked it. I have to finish this in a matter of hours. Anywhere from generally 2 to 4 or 5 hours is what I'll spend on a 5x7. So in that time, I try to get as much little fun stuff going on in there as I can. As much as I like that little stroke that created the stock for that leaf, I'm going to probably change that because it'll be easier to change that one, I think, than to change that other long leaf, the ones that are going both the same direction. You notice with a lot of this, I try not to overwork the strokes. I'll get the paint that I want on there, and then as often as I can, I try to lay down the shape that I want in one stroke, and then vary the pressure that I put on that stroke so that it naturally levels off or tapers off. It helps to create a more natural feeling, better edges, and more natural three-dimensional quality to it. Sometimes you'll see a little bit of something appear magically to the side or something. That's just, I cleaned a brush and didn't think you'd want to waste your time having that in the video. So if you see things change, you haven't missed anything. Still got all the paint in there, the brush strokes, all that sort of thing. I just took out everything else. That was a waste of your time to watch. All right, so you notice that the top of that stem kind of disappeared into the background. It's because the values and color temperatures are too closely aligned. So I need to punch that up, give it more to bring it out away from the background. Instead of adding white to it, which is going to kill the color more, I warmed it up. Added more of the cadmium yellow medium. And wow, that was way too thick for a hollyhock stem, especially for with what I'm trying to do. I want a much more subtle play of shapes and highlights and values in here. I really want to have the background, a nice delineated shape between those parts of the plant. I want that to feel more like the background back there. That's why I'm working so much at trying to get rid of my mistake there. So that's where, instead of coming back in and trying to replace exactly what that original wash in the background was, I'm just going to add a little bit of darker tone in there, vary things up a bit. But then if I put it in one area, I need to put it in other areas around throughout the painting so that it feels as if it belongs, not like it's out of the blue splotch, that kind of the Sesame Street thing. One of these things is not like the others. Yeah, I don't want that going on. It'll draw way too much attention to it. So now I'm coming back in to put in some shadow work throughout the piece. Get a nice warm, darker green. This will really help to finalize the three-dimensional quality. You have to be careful coming back in and putting shadows in after you've put in some of the lighter colors, because that white will tend to dull and deaden your darks. Just like that, picking up a color. Overall, I'll try to capture the brush stroke in all at once. Put my brush down, lay it in, and leave it. Don't go back in and manipulate it too much unless I'm playing with some of the edges or trying to work the brush stroke for a particular look or technique, a very specific purpose. But otherwise, don't noodle the brush stroke. Don't fidget and mess around with it thinking that the more you work it, the better it's going to get. Because generally speaking, working with the brush stroke after you've placed it down is only going to catch the colors that are underneath it, mix them together and muddy them down. It'll lose a lot of the vitality. This is a little bit cooler green, a nice mid-tone green. Trying to create a shadow green in there. Now, when I say cooler than what I had before, but still tended to be on the warm side. So I lay the warmer one down and then top that with a little bit of a cooler green to make it more translucent and pop it out a little bit. I like a couple different, usually a few different values, some of those areas like that. And sometimes I'm just experimenting to see what's going to work, what feels right. Now with some of this, I'll probably lay this orange in a bit and then come back in with a couple more variations, subtle variations to change that up. And that'll give it a nice play of warms and cool colors within those small areas. Makes it more interesting and fun for the viewer. And besides that, each flower is going to have different amounts of light coming into it, depending on the angle of the flower. So if I vary up the shadow and the warm and cool greens and oranges and yellows that I put in there, then it helps to create that variety within the flowers that tell the viewer that one flower is getting a little bit more light than another one. And it helps to fix the angle of those flowers a little bit. That was a little too much. What I'm doing is manipulating the three-dimensional quality of these stamen that's sticking out there. So I have the highlight and then just take a little bit of warm shadow color to place on the back side of it. And when you look at a cylinder, and these are more on the rounded side, so if you look at a cylinder, you'll have the highlight, the halftone, the shadow, several variations within the light side and the shadow side. That's what I'm doing with these different colors that I'm putting down, trying to create that variety of shadow and highlight and the variations within each one. I'm not satisfied with, in this piece, with just putting down a highlight and then leaving it because it pops out away from the rest of the painting. I want to give it a little bit more than that. here I'm coming back in with a little stronger saturated hue with cad red mixed in there with the alizarin crimson, and maybe a little bit of that transparent oxide red or something like that, so that I can get that translucent. The sun is peeking through the little holes in between the petals there in the middle of the flower, creating that almost glowing color that comes there in the middle. So here's the point where I have to be careful not overworking things. I've just not been quite satisfied with the structure of the flowers. So I'm trying to simplify some of the work that I've done with the highlights and things, getting a variety within the different flowers. I have to be very careful at this point that I do keep it simple, that I don't overwork it and lose the vitality that I like in the very beginning stages of the painting. Some of the things that I have to keep in my mind as I go along it with a piece like this, that small flower at the very top, or like smaller, if I keep it too dark and it's up there all by itself, it'll become the center of attention and might draw too much attention up there, an inordinate amount. So I have to determine where I want the viewer looking and make sure that my areas of contrast, my stronger areas of color, that they're placed in the places where I want the viewer to look, and still have enough interest and fun around the piece that it draws the viewer all around the painting. There's not necessarily any right or wrong to it. You don't have to have one center of interest, one focal point. You can have multiple focal points. Like I said, there are no rules. So it's just the viewer will be able to fill, and you as an artist hopefully will be able to fill as well, Although we can kind of get lost sometimes in the making of it, but the viewer can feel when it's working, if a painting gets too busy or if there's not enough interest in it to keep the viewer coming back. That's really what it's all about. Finding that happy spot where it all works, where the viewer is really engaged in the piece overall. I'm going to try a little bit different type of highlight here. Making it a little bit more cool. Yikes, a little bit too much on that stroke. I have to tone that down and break it up. So I'll try out colors here and there, and if I like one, then I will generally place it in a couple places, at least 3 or 4. To help that harmony I want throughout the piece. Generally I want to have constant variations within the colors that I use, but I also want to have those same colors placed in more than just one location on the painting. It helps to create a much better harmony throughout the piece. That doesn't mean that they have to be obvious, though. I can do real subtle placement of some of those. Right now these leaves are a little lackluster. They need to pop out a bit more from that background. So I'll get a series of different highlight shapes and then come back in here in a bit and put in some a little bit stronger shadow work in there. And when I talk about that, that doesn't mean that it has to be that way. Sometimes I want something to blend in and dissolve and disappear into the background. This is simply a judgment call based on my feelings about the whole painting overall. Guess that was a little redundant, whole and overall. Sorry about that. Where I liked the colors in there, right now they just felt they were a little too strong, the way that they were coming forward, toning some of those down and pushing them back a little bit. A little bit more exciting color. Just a few drops of it here and there. Little tiny bits of it placed just to liven things up a bit. You notice that some areas of the painting will demand attention because of the contrast of light and dark, and other areas will pull the viewer over to them based on the saturation of the pigment or the hue, the color. Those reds demand a lot of attention. So I have to make sure when I do that, that I step back, look in my mirror, and make sure that they don't shout at me, that they don't demand too much attention and take away from the rest of the painting. But I also don't want to get so timid that I fail to take a risk and punch areas and make them more exciting. Then I'll just end up with a dull painting, and that's no fun for me or anybody else. So if it doesn't work, if it's too strong and garish or blatant, then I can come back in and place a color over the top of that, or take my empty brush and wipe it off a bit. But it's always worth attempting it at least, just to see how it does. Sometimes you can get really lucky and find a combination that just dazzles. Right here I'm employing the principle of overlap. Punching the edge, especially the top edge of that leaf, really helped to push that other hollyhock back behind it more. So the contrast of that light and dark will help to minimize a bit that strong red that I have in that hollyhock, because it'll help to push that back. It diminishes it to a degree, hopefully enough that I can leave that red in there. Some of the little things that I'm putting in here are difficult to see when you have oh, okay, real quick, that little stroke, those are the ones that I have a lot of fun with. And they're the ones that I leave normally for the end of the painting. just kind of let the brush dance on the edge there, and you can get some fun movement and shape doing that. But let's see, what was I talking about before? Oh yeah, the little things that you don't show up in photographs. The reason why it's so important to work from life as much as possible. When I put in some of these little light and dark shifts, much of that gets lost just because the camera can't pick up the same contrast that the eye can. It doesn't see as many colors as the eye sees. It doesn't capture as many value shifts as what your eyes and your mind can perceive. So study flowers and landscape and everything else as much as possible from life, so that when you're in the studio using your references and your imagination and your studies, you can recall those little shifts. So those little bits of light and dark like that might not necessarily be apparent in your photograph. You have to use what you know as an artist and what you've studied on location to bring more life to the painting. Remember that in a photograph, often, especially depending on the knowledge and skill of the photographer, the highlights are going to be much brighter and more blown out in a photograph than in reality, and the shadows are not going to have nearly the depth and detail, the real beautiful, subtle variations of value and color temperature and shape as what you would see if you were there on location. Now, of course, when you're on location, we as artists should be squinting down as much as possible so that we can see the shapes to simplify the shapes, so we can see the real shifts in value that way. But even with squinting down, if you pay close attention and ponder on it, study it more than just an initial glimpse, take the time to really study while you're squinting, and you'll start to see a whole lot of fun material there that might be lost in a quick glance or a casual perusal of the subject matter. And those little shifts come in real handy to make a painting more fun to paint and more fun to look at when it's all finished. Of course, these initial shadow details that I'm putting in right now are a little strong. They're too dark for the leaf, the way that the light would filter through that leaf. Now, sometimes you can get some very strong shadows, much more so than many artists are inclined to put in there. I like contrast, but I also want to be careful that my shadows aren't overly dark for the overall situation in the painting, and that when they are dark, that they're not a dead dark. What do I mean by that? Usually if it's a dead dark, it means that the color temperature is not quite appropriate for the light source. If it feels dead, it means that usually it's not a matter of changing the value. It's a matter of changing the temperature. So I'll either make it warmer or cooler. The safest bet is to err on the side of warm, I found with shadows and color temperature. But really, over time, the more that you're outdoors, the more that you're really studying your subject matter and squinting and paying attention to learning about color temperature, trying to determine if you can right then and there see whether it's a cool temperature or a warm temperature. The more that you work at that, the quicker you'll get at determining whether it should be warm, whether you need to warm it up or cool it down. And then even after 30 years, I still have to experiment here and there to get some of it right. If you saw when I was manipulating that paint on the palette, I will blend the color that I want. Try not to overblend it, because I like all the changes in color tone. If I don't overblend the paint. But then once I've blended it to the point that I want, I pull the brush back and scoop it forward through the paint so I can pick up enough paint on the end of my brush that I can lay down what I want in one stroke. If the paint's too thin on the brush, then it's not going to lay down nicely, and I'll have to then end up overworking the stroke, trying to push and get more paint down on the painting. So generally, if I don't pick up enough paint the first time, I don't sit there and try to force the brush with greater pressure so I can get more paint. I'll just come back and grab more paint and then try it all over again. Take the same stroke and try to do that same stroke again until I get it right. Often when there's a stem that comes in and attaches to the branch, or when there's a leaf or something that attaches to the stem of the flower, there'll be a little knob there or something that creates a little bit more structure. So putting a highlight on the top of that will help to change the dynamics of the stem. Gives it more interest. Now it's time for the signature. And one thing I wanted to point out too, on the leaf on the left, when I put that stem in there, notice I didn't make a real strong shadow or highlight coming down the entire length of that stem. And let some of it blend into the background, because the mind will fill it in. It'll complete the shape of that and make it so that people know that it's not cut off in the middle there. And it makes it more interesting to look at. Thanks for stopping by. Now get out there and paint your own masterpiece. Oh, and before you go, don't forget to subscribe to my channel. And if you're interested in any of my videos, just go to my website at inmanfinearts.com and you can find them all there. Have a great day painting.